Where we are now is the beginning of the second week of the full season release. So after a week of Mythic Plus and after a week of Mythic Raiding. So what we will be busy for today is to go over exactly how things are looking when it comes to the performance and the popularity, the play rate of the specs in the raid after a first full week of, I guess, progression in Mythic Raiding. We can still take a look, a preliminary initial look, perhaps just to look at how things are changing from the heroic results compared to the Mythic Raiding results. This is weirdly enough what you would look at if you looked at the results in heroic Anu'bar Palace, which sees somehow Destruction Warlock being the better performing specs in heroic. But that's not really how the meta, how the flavor of the month specs, or how the idea of who is very strong and who is very weak, that's not really where they are formed. It is of course in the results from Mythic Raiding. Now we do this every tier, so we have to point this out every tier. These are subject to changing the more you go deep into the raid and the more different bosses you kill, because every new boss will have a different damage profile, which means certain specs will be doing better than others. For example, at the moment, talking about Ovinax, there are practically still no logs, because there were like 10 guilds in the world killing Ovinax, private logs, you have no results, and Ovinax does have a lot of AoE damage, a lot of cleave, which will influence a lot the rankings on this boss, as opposed to something, for example, like Sikran, which is pure single target, except many players have already killed Sikran, whereas nobody that has been logged on Warcraft logs has killed Broad Twister. So when you look at the full results, you will have more value, for example, on single target damage, because certain bosses being pure single target, for example, have already been killed, whereas others that might favor more AoE damage, for example, have not been really killed yet, or at least they haven't made it into the logs. So Blizzard devs will be quite happy to see this initial set of results, with having two different mage specs currently at the top of the results, both Arcane, which was the predictable one, but also Fire Mage. Now, it's pretty funny when you go and check out aggregator sites like Archon, which is, straight up coming from Warcraft logs, showing you that actually the absolute worst specs at the bottom of everyone else is Fire Mage. Even though if you actually check their average DPS, Fire Mage is technically the highest one out of all of them, because this one is checking the popularity of the specs and this one is checking purely the results. Because if you go and look at the actual popularity of the specs, Fire Mage is almost 30 times less played than an Arcane Mage. Even Frost, which is not having a good time, is played 3 times more than a Fire Mage currently is. So yes, technically speaking, Fire Mage is doing very well, but also the amount of players playing Fire are very few. It is kind of a first world problem to have, to be fair, because it's still within the Mage class, which already has another spec doing very well. We could say perhaps not first world, maybe advanced second world problem with Shaman, which is mostly similar because you have enhancement and elemental doing very well. The difference though is that unlike the mages, if we switch from the throughput, from the actual numbers, and just look at the popularity, both of the specs are not doing bad either. They're nowhere near the level of unplayedness of Fire when you look at the amount of players playing both elemental and enhancement. So not only are they both doing quite well, they are also being played quite a lot. So perhaps, if anything, it is an even healthier situation than for the mage specs. Being more similar to mages, we go back to this very lopsided difference in results is the DKs. Because again, just like Arcane and Fire, you have Frost and Unholy, and the results are very similar. Mage is some 25,000 DPS below Fire, Unholy is about 19,000 DPS below Frost. But then you look at the popularity and there is a very similar difference, a very similar gap between Arcane and Fire, and then Unholy and Frost. But those are still, though, we can say definitely, these are still some pretty good first world problems to have when it comes to your performance, because you just have the choice. You can just pick and choose within your class who is doing better. Who, on the other hand, do not have these kinds of luxuries, are specs that are locked into their only choice in their class. For example, specs like Retribution Paladin, like Havoc Demon Hunter, like Shadow Priest, if you are playing only melee, like Survival in Hunter, or like Feral in Druid, or like Balance for ranged as a druid. So these specs kind of don't really have another choice to move out to, like for example mages or death knights do. And unfortunately for them, things are not looking too good. Balance is at the moment one of the worst performers in the raid, together with Shadow Priest as well. It doesn't feel nearly as bad to also say, well, Frost Mage is also doing just as bad as they are. Yes, but Frost Mage also has these two, and Shadow doesn't, and Balance doesn't. So it's a much worse situation for them, even though they have been buffed multiple times by Blizzard. At the latest, just one day ago, Shadow Priest was buffed by 4% in damage, so we might see some slight improvements this reset based on the buffs they have received. Shadow is also quite unfortunate, if we have to be honest, because when you look at the popularity, Shadow is very low. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, these kind of specs might be bailed out by the fact that they need a raid buff. So it would have been certainly possible to see a Shadow Priest very high in popularity, so a Shadow Priest brought very often in the raid around this mark, similar to Balance, for example, if the other specs in your class were bad. For example, if you have, Feral, which is very underplayed, and Restoration Druid is terrible, and nobody plays Guardian Tank, then even if you're a bad spec at the moment, you would still find yourself a spot in the raid because of it. Somewhat similar could have been said from Windwalker, right? Mistweaver isn't really popular right now. If guilds don't run a Brewmaster, it means Windwalker gets an easy spot. That is something that sometimes can save your spec for being played in the raid, even if it's not great. Imagine, for example, Havoc Demon Hunter not being great. Well, no tanks are playing Vengeance in the raid, so you were going to have a Havoc Demon Hunter in the raid anyways. Not the case for Shadow, because the healing priests are being played, at least one of them, for this very reason. Not the case either for Balance, because Guardian Druid right now is a pretty popular tank. But they don't really get to go away with it either when it comes to the freebie raid spot guaranteed for them because of their raid buff. Now, we can also observe some of the differences in these performances, not just based on all damage, all bosses, by going a little bit in depth boss by boss, starting with the more important one out of the ones that are being tracked, which is the one for pure single target damage, no adds whatsoever. So on this boss you really get to see the, I guess, potential of single target damage of each of these specs. And Sikran shows quite a few good examples of weaknesses and strengths of specs, because for example, if we go back to all bosses, right, overall damage, Frost and Unholy are super high, but then you go back to pure single target and they just fall all the way down to the bottom half. Another spec that was doing very well on all bosses was Havoc, all right, top 7 results in all boss damage, and then you go to single target and Havoc goes much further down. Obviously, if these specs, which are getting so high in overall damage, are so low on a single target boss, they must pick up the ranking somewhere else. So you move over to a more ad focused type of fight and they're back to a higher result, even the first boss with a lot of ads spawning in the intermission, and they go back up to being quite high in the results. So you can see already the differences between the damage profiles of each of the bosses, whether it is for single target results. Specs like BM in single target are doing very well together with Arcane Mage, but also Survival, surprisingly enough, Enhancement, Devastation, Red Paladin when it comes to single target damage as opposed to just the overall damage results. Not really much of a difference if we were to look at the best performers. If we were to cut the results at only the top 90 percentile results, there isn't really much of a difference. You still see the same specs being in more or less the same positions that they were before. It will be interesting to see as we go deeper and deeper into the raid tier and you get to see more and more entries on more and more bosses fought more and more differently. For example, Ovinax will be very ad heavy in terms of results, but then you're gonna have Princess, which is gonna be very single target heavy because it's practically just a single target fight. So it will fluctuate a lot between the results. Every week when you start getting more and more entries on different bosses, it will be bound to change more and more. For example, this week and next week, when you have more and more kills of Brute Twister, obviously specs that were doing very well on single target will start falling down more in the overall results, because specs with good AoE will have good results on Broad Twister, which will increase their overall rankings. And then a few weeks later, after more guilds go through Nexus Princess, which is pure single target, then the specs that were doing good pure single target, like BM Hunter, will go back up again. That is sort of the ebb and flow when it comes to these results for the DPS. Now, this is not quite the same logic that you can apply when it comes to healing. Because healing, there's not going to be a pure single target healing fight and then a pure AoE healing fight, right? More or less, you can expect the same results in different boss fights when it comes to healing. And this is a problem because, well, we have already touched on this, what the problem is. We have made an entire video about the problem, which is Flame Shaper Preservation Evoker. Absolutely insane results right now. At the moment, by far the strongest healer when it comes to Season 1 Tier 1 expansion release out of practically almost all of the previous expansions. It's not even that hugely popular, that's the thing, because it wasn't discovered, it wasn't known until very recently. So you didn't have stacks upon stacks of players prepping Preservation Evoker because they knew this was going to happen, and that's why there isn't really nearly as many as you would have expected by this power. If you were to see this in a DPS result, 90% of the DPS would be playing this, pretty much. Not really when it comes to this Preservation Evoker build. Not really much to say about the power of the healers in the raid. The popularity, as mentioned, isn't really that high for Preservation Evoker compared to their throughput, which is, at the moment, averaging a modest 25-ish% ahead of any other healer. The gap, once you exclude this, once you eliminate this from the game, right, it doesn't exist. The gap after, it's much more balanced. You do have, from the worst to the best, you have a gap of about 10%, which is perhaps slightly too big, but everyone from top to bottom being within 10% is an acceptable range of power. You can even see it here that from Paladin to Discipline Priest, it's even more balanced. So really, the only issues are the weakness at the bottom and the much higher power at the top. The weakness at the bottom has been addressed because Resto Druid has now gotten 2 back-to-back weekly buffs. Blizzard is clearly aware of the weaknesses of Resto Druid, so we will see this week, after another round of buffs, 4% to all of their healing, how they will improve, and then we will have to wait, very likely, for the end of this reset for the Race to World First to end before we see any nerfs to Preservation Evoker. Because it's whatever if you buff Resto Druid, because no guild in the top guilds is running a Resto Druid because of this very reason. But it will be a much bigger problem if mid-progression of the last couple of bosses this reset you heavily nerfed Preservation Evoker. So basically the judgment on the healers is on hold until we see the, I guess, deserved nerfs to Preservation Evoker. I guess we don't have to put all of the Evoker in one basket. We should just mention Flame Shaper Evoker is the one that needs to be nerfed, not Preservation Evoker as a whole. Just the one hero talent that is being the problem right now. Now, for the memes, we can look at something else. For the memes, we can also look at the deaths, just in case you were wondering which are the clowniest of the specs, the one that are more prone to die during progression. These are your average deaths of the specs, so you get to check the death rate of any one of these specs. If you're looking for the important deaths, then sure, let's just check only the wipe deaths, just to see who is more prone to bricking your pool because they are dying. We can already see some of the effects. The ones thought to be one of the squishier of the classes, Shaman, it currently is not. They are in fact towards the tankier level of specs at the moment. Who instead was also thought to be one of the squishiest of the specs was Balance. And yes, it's confirmed. Balance is indeed the deathiest of the specs whenever you are progressing and you're wiping. Balanced Druid has a 1 in 5 chances to actually die in any one of your pulls. Perhaps more surprising that Arcane, if anything Mage as a whole, but also Arcane, is so prone to dying. Obviously, you know, Fire, they have their cheat death, so their death chance is cut in half, so it makes sense for them to be much lower than Arcane. Still though, this seems quite high for this spec. You do have some traditional positions in here, some old faithfuls like Discipline. Discipline is a forever top 5 specs in terms of dying percentage. Hunters, I guess, even after the rework and the much talked about increased tankiness, they are still very prone to die compared to other specs. What perhaps might be more surprising given the power and that you can already see in Outlaw and Sub is Assassination, which is actually dying a lot compared to the other 2 rogue specs. What is perhaps even funnier is that at the bottom, of course at the bottom you have tanks. They are less likely to die. So you see Brew, Prot, Guardian, Blood, Vengeance and Prot Paladin, and then even lower than them you have the 2 DPS DK specs, which have a absurdly low death chance. This is very, very low, makes them very good for progression given how safe they are every pull compared to some of these other specs, for example. You can also see this pictured if you look at another type of aggregator by looking at the survivability of these specs, and again, the 2 DK specs are far above, well over 10% above in terms of survivability over everyone else, with Balanced Druid being the worst at the moment. This one is for now the recap when it comes to the performance and the results of the specs. When it comes to Mythic results, Mythic raiding results, of course we're not putting that much focus or that much emphasis or importance on tanks because there isn't really much to point out. We currently have a super popular Blood, and the other role, the other spot for the tank is mostly being split between either Brewmaster or Guardian Druid. That's kind of what it is right now. Pretty much depending on what your guild is bringing. Does your guild have a Windwalker Monk? Do they not? Let's bring a Brewmaster. Does your guild play with a Resto Druid or a Balanced Druid? Do they not? Just play with a Guardian Druid. And that's the more or less the composition of tanks right now in the raid. So with this being done, we are now done also with the recap of this first week of Mythic raiding that has gone by, and we are now entered in the second. Of course, as we go by, we will get more and more entries, more and more logs, and more results to look at. Hopefully, we will also be getting more and more balancing on Blizzard's end. As we mentioned, we might have to wait a few more days because of the Race to World First being still on the way. But after that, we could be seeing even more changes in the very near future. Right before, let's not forget, expected to be more or less a month from now, 10.0.5 for the anniversary patch that already has a lot of balance tuning on its way. But for today, on this Thursday, we can now stop here. So we are starting with our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, but also everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, thank you to the weather, who has now just temporarily stopped being cloudy and rainy just in time for me to go out.